When I first realized my wife hadn't invited me to her graduation ceremony, I thought it was a mistake. A missed email. A forgotten message. Something small that could be explained away with an apology and a laugh later that night. I had supported her for 4 years. Early mornings when she cried over textbooks. Late nights when she fell asleep on the couch with notes spread across her chest. I paid the rent when her stipend ran dry. I cooked when she said she didn't have time. I defended her when my family said she was chasing a dream too big for her. So, when social media exploded with photos of her in a cap and gown, smiling under a banner with her name in gold letters, my chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain. Everyone was there. Her friends. Her colleagues. Her mentors. Even people I barely recognized. Everyone except me. I didn't call immediately. I waited. I told myself there must be a reason. By the time she came home that evening, still glowing, still wearing that smile that once belonged only to me, I asked quietly, "Why didn't you tell me about your graduation?" The room changed. Her smile hardened. Her shoulders squared. And then she did something I never expected. She laughed. Not a soft laugh. Not an embarrassed one. A sharp, dismissive laugh that made the people still lingering in our living room go silent. "Why would I invite you?" she said loudly. Every head turned. I felt my face burn. "I'm your husband," I said, keeping my voice low. That's when she shouted. "I didn't need you there. This wasn't about you. I earned this on my own. Stop trying to attach yourself to my success." The room froze. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Another person pretended to check their phone. I wanted to disappear. She kept going. "You wouldn't even fit in. Everyone there mattered." That sentence stayed with me longer than the humiliation. Everyone there mattered. Which meant, in her eyes, I didn't. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I went to bed silently beside a woman who no longer saw me as a partner, but as a shadow she wanted to outgrow. Over the next few weeks, I noticed things I had ignored for years. The way she corrected me in public. The way she referred to my future instead of our future. The way her new friends treated me like furniture. She was changing. And she was proud of leaving me behind. The breaking point came when I overheard her on the phone one night. Laughing. Telling someone, "He thinks he helped me. That's cute." Something in me went quiet. I stopped asking questions. I stopped trying to be included. I started listening. I learned about her plans. About the job she was expecting. About the network she thought she had built alone. What she didn't know was that the quiet man she underestimated had spent years building his own world. Connections she never asked about. Investments she never noticed. A reputation she never bothered to understand. I wasn't loud. I wasn't flashy. But I was known. And when the opportunity came, I didn't sabotage her. I didn't scream. I didn't expose her publicly. I did something far worse. I stepped back. I withdrew the support she had mistaken for weakness. The introductions she assumed came from her charm alone quietly stopped. Doors that once opened easily began to close, one by one. When she asked what was happening, I smiled gently. "I thought you did everything on your own," I said. The look on her face was the same look I had worn the night she shouted at me. Confusion. Embarrassment. Fear. By the time she realized how much of her success had rested on things she never acknowledged, it was too late. Not because I destroyed her. But because I finally chose myself. I left without drama. Without shouting. Without a scene. Months later, I heard she still talks about that graduation day. How it was the moment everything changed. She thinks it was the day she outgrew me. She never realized it was the day I stopped standing behind her and started walking away. I didn't leave immediately. That would have been too obvious. Too emotional. Instead, I stayed long enough to watch her unravel. She began coming home later. Not because she was busy, but because she didn't want to face the silence I had become. I no longer asked how her day went. I no longer offered opinions. I listened without reacting, and that unsettled her more than anger ever could. She needed resistance to feel powerful. My calm took that from her. The first crack appeared when the company she expected to hire her postponed the final offer. She came home furious, pacing the living room, blaming politics, jealous seniors, incompetent management. I nodded once and said nothing. Finally, she snapped. "Aren't you going to say something?" I looked up from my phone. "You earned everything on your own," I said evenly. "You'll figure it out." The words hit her harder than any insult. Because this time, they weren't shouted. They were believed. Days later, another email arrived. Then another silence. Her classmates were posting promotions. Celebration dinners. Office photos with glass walls and skyline views. She stopped posting. At night, she lay awake scrolling, her thumb moving faster the more desperate she became. I could feel the tension beside me, but I didn't reach out. One evening, she asked a question that told me everything. "Do you think people still take me seriously?" I turned and studied her face. The confidence that once overflowed now leaked at the edges. "Respect," I said slowly, "comes from consistency. People notice patterns." She swallowed. I knew she was replaying every moment she had dismissed me. Every introduction she cut short. Every time she spoke over me. The irony was quiet and complete. Weeks later, she finally asked for help. Not directly. She phrased it like pride still mattered. "Do you know anyone who could give advice?" I thought of the dinners I once brought her to. The meetings she skipped. The people who asked about her afterward and never heard back. "I might," I said. "But I don't want to attach myself to your success." She stared at me, realization dawning too late. That night, she cried. Not softly. Not privately. She sobbed the way people do when the story they tell themselves collapses. "I didn't mean it," she said. "I was stressed. I worked hard. I just wanted my moment." I believed her. And that was the saddest part. Because moments pass. Character stays. I moved out 2 weeks later. No argument. No begging. Just boxes and quiet. She followed me to the door. "You're really leaving?" I paused. "Yes." "For this?" she asked, voice shaking. "No," I replied. "For everything you thought didn't matter." The divorce wasn't ugly. It was empty. And emptiness frightens people more than conflict. Months passed. Then a year. I heard updates through mutual acquaintances. She changed industries. Then cities. Then narratives. In her version, we grew apart. I didn't correct her. The truth didn't need witnesses anymore. The final encounter came unexpectedly. A professional conference. Different field. Same city. I was speaking on a panel. She sat 3 rows back. Our eyes met for half a second. She looked away first. After the session, people gathered around me. Questions. Introductions. Respect offered freely. She hovered at the edge of the crowd, unsure where she fit now. When it thinned, she approached. "You look confident," she said carefully. "I always was," I answered. She nodded, biting her lip. "I didn't know," she whispered. "That," I said, "was the problem." There was no dramatic ending. No applause. No final insult. Just 2 people standing in the aftermath of choices. She walked away smaller than the last time I saw her. Not because she failed. But because she finally understood what she had lost. As for me, I never attended another graduation ceremony after that. I learned something more valuable. The loudest revenge is living so well that silence becomes your statement. After that conference I didn't think about her for a long time, not because I forced myself to forget but because she no longer occupied space in my decisions, and that was the truest form of freedom I had known. Life became quieter in a good way. Mornings were intentional. Evenings were calm. I rebuilt routines that had once revolved around supporting someone else's ambition and redirected them toward my own growth. I took projects I had postponed, accepted invitations I once declined, and allowed myself to be seen without shrinking. Somewhere along the way, people began to associate my name with reliability, clarity, and quiet authority. I never announced it. I simply showed up consistently. Then one afternoon, long after the wounds had scarred over, she sent a message. No greeting. No apology. Just a question. "Do you ever regret leaving?" I stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. "I regret staying longer than I should have," I replied. Minutes passed. Then dots appeared. Then disappeared. Finally, a message came through. "I didn't know how much you carried." I exhaled slowly. That sentence alone proved everything. She had never looked closely enough to notice. I typed one last response. That's why I had to put it down. I blocked the number afterward, not out of anger, but out of respect for the life I had built without her weight. Time continued to do what it always does, separating lessons from pain. People who met me later never knew that version of my life, the one where I stood quietly in the background while someone else took credit for the foundation I helped lay. They only knew the man who spoke calmly and was listened to, the man whose presence didn't need validation. Sometimes I think about that graduation day, not with bitterness, but with clarity. If she had invited me, if she had thanked me, if she had seen me, I might have stayed. And staying would have been the real loss. That public humiliation, that shout meant to reduce me, ended up giving me the sharpest gift of all. It showed me exactly how small I was allowed to be in her world. And once you see that, you either accept it or you leave. I left. Not loudly. Not dramatically. I left correctly. And years later, when people ask me what changed my life, I don't mention betrayal or revenge or success. I say something simpler. I learned that love without respect is just patience being abused, and the moment I stopped begging for a seat in someone else's celebration was the moment my own life finally began. Years passed in a way that felt unreal at first, like I had stepped into a life that had been waiting patiently for me to arrive. My career stabilized, then expanded, not through dramatic leaps but through steady trust built over time. People came to me for decisions, for counsel, for leadership, and every time they did, I remembered the man who once stood in his own living room being told he didn't matter. That memory didn't hurt anymore, but it sharpened me. One evening, at a formal dinner hosted by an organization I now advised, I saw her name on the guest list. I felt nothing at first, which surprised me more than anger ever could have. When she entered the room, she looked composed, polished, successful on the surface, but something in her posture had changed. Confidence borrowed from applause never sits the same as confidence earned through endurance. She noticed me mid-conversation, surrounded by people listening intently, and froze for half a breath before masking it with a practiced smile. When she finally approached, it was with caution, as though I were a version of reality she hadn't prepared for. "I didn't know you were involved at this level," she said, attempting casual surprise. I nodded politely. "Neither did you back then," I replied, not unkindly, just truthfully. She laughed softly, the sound thin. "You've done well," she said. "So have you," I answered, and meant it, because success without peace is still failure, and I could see how hard she was still running. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever tell people about us?" I looked at her, really looked, and realized she was asking whether she still existed in my story. "No," I said gently. "You were a chapter, not the book." That was when her composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for her to understand that the revenge she feared had already happened, not through destruction, but through irrelevance. We parted cordially, two adults bound only by memory, and as I walked away, I felt a strange gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the clarity it forced upon me. Because some people don't betray you to ruin you. They betray you to reveal who you would have remained if you stayed. And the greatest justice isn't watching them fall, it's realizing you rose so far above the version of yourself they were comfortable disrespecting that their voice no longer echoes in your life at all. The months after that dinner confirmed something I had only begun to suspect, that closure does not arrive with conversations or apologies but with distance that no longer feels like absence. I stopped measuring time by milestones we once planned together and started marking it by personal clarity, the quiet satisfaction of waking up without resentment, the ease of decisions made without needing approval. My circle changed too, not in size but in substance, people who valued presence over performance, respect over appearances. Occasionally her name resurfaced through distant connections, always wrapped in explanations about transitions and reinventions, and every time I heard it, I felt the same calm detachment one feels when recalling a city they once lived in but no longer miss. Then one day, unexpectedly, I received an invitation to speak at a graduation ceremony, not hers, not even the same institution, but a room full of people standing at the edge of their future. As I stepped onto the stage and looked out at the crowd, I felt the weight of irony settle gently rather than sharply. I spoke about perseverance, about unseen labor, about the danger of mistaking applause for worth, and as I spoke, I realized I was finally standing in the moment I had once been denied, not as a guest, not as a supporter in the shadows, but as someone whose voice carried meaning on its own. When the ceremony ended and students lined up to thank me, I felt something complete itself quietly inside me. Later that night, alone, I thought back to the man who had stood humiliated in front of strangers and understood something he could not have known then, that dignity lost in public can be reclaimed privately through integrity, patience, and the courage to walk away when respect is no longer offered. My revenge was never about her downfall or regret, though I know regret followed her like a shadow she pretended not to see. My revenge was becoming a man who would never again need to ask why he wasn't invited, because he learned to build a life where his presence was assumed, valued, and earned. And in that life, the silence she once used to diminish me became the proof that I had finally outgrown the need to be seen by someone who never truly looked at me at all. Came quietly, the way real turning points always do, without announcements or witnesses. It began with a decision I made one morning while standing in front of the mirror, realizing that for the first time in years, my reflection did not look tired from carrying someone else's expectations. I enrolled in programs I once postponed, not because I needed credentials, but because I wanted mastery. I stopped explaining my choices. I stopped overgiving. I stopped mistaking loyalty for love. Opportunities multiplied in ways that felt almost unfair, yet I knew they were the delayed returns on years of discipline no one applauded. People who once overlooked me now introduced me with reverence, and every time my name was spoken with respect, I remembered how easily it had once been dismissed in my own home. One afternoon, I received news that she had left another position abruptly. No scandal, no drama, just another quiet exit framed as a personal decision. I felt no satisfaction, only understanding. She had always been chasing rooms where she could feel important without having to be accountable. I had chosen the opposite path, rooms where responsibility came first and recognition followed naturally. A mutual acquaintance later told me she still compared every man she met to me, measuring their patience, their steadiness, their willingness to support without shrinking. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need details. I already knew the truth she was discovering too late, that respect once broken is not repaired by regret, and love once devalued cannot be reclaimed by memory. That night, as I sat alone in a space I had built from the ground up, I felt something deeper than happiness settle in my chest. Peace earned, not borrowed. The kind that comes when you no longer wonder what you could have done differently, because you finally understand that the moment she shouted in front of everyone was not the moment she embarrassed me, it was the moment she revealed herself, and that revelation set me free long before I ever walked away. Unfolded without drama, but with finality. I was invited to collaborate on a long-term project that required visibility, trust, and leadership, the kind of role that exposes who you are when no one is watching, and I accepted without hesitation. As months passed, my name became associated with outcomes, not promises, and people sought me out not because I was loud, but because I was consistent. One evening, while reviewing documents in my office, I received an email from her professional address, formal, restrained, almost afraid. She congratulated me on my recent achievements, mentioned she had followed my work from a distance, and ended with a line that carried more weight than she intended: "I hope you know I never meant to hurt you." I read it once, then again, and finally closed my laptop without replying. Not because I was cruel, but because intent does not erase impact, and explanations do not rebuild what contempt has dismantled. I realized then that the story between us no longer required my participation to reach its conclusion. The power dynamic she once controlled by withholding validation had reversed completely, not because I sought dominance, but because I no longer needed anything from her, not understanding, not apology, not acknowledgement. Weeks later, I heard she had attended another graduation ceremony, this time as a guest, sitting quietly in the back, clapping politely for others, and the image struck me harder than any confrontation could have. She finally understood what it felt like to be present and unseen. As for me, I kept moving forward, not fueled by revenge, but by alignment, the calm certainty that comes when your life finally reflects your worth. And in that certainty, I understood the deepest truth of all, that the loudest insult fades with time, but the quiet decision to walk away from disrespect echoes for a lifetime, shaping every room you enter long after the voices that once tried to diminish you have gone silent. Arrived at a point when I no longer measured progress by success but by stability, the kind that doesn't shake when recognition pauses or plans shift. I moved into a home that felt intentional, not extravagant, but solid, chosen with care rather than impulse, and for the first time I noticed how much lighter life feels when every decision belongs fully to you. My work expanded internationally, bringing conversations with people who valued depth over noise, and in those rooms I was neither underestimated nor elevated unfairly, I was simply respected, and that balance grounded me. Somewhere during that season, I realized I had stopped replaying the past entirely, not because it no longer mattered, but because it had finally finished teaching me. Then one evening, while attending a private gathering hosted by a mutual contact, I saw her again across the room, standing alone near a window, watching others laugh in groups she wasn't quite part of. Our eyes met briefly, and for the first time, there was no tension, no pride, no regret strong enough to surface. She nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of shared history, and I returned it without hesitation. No words were needed. The silence between us was no longer heavy, it was resolved. As I turned back to my conversation, I understood something with complete certainty, that revenge does not always arrive as triumph over another person. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of pain where it once lived, the calm knowledge that the person who once diminished you no longer has the power to affect your breath, your sleep, or your future. And in that realization, I felt a gratitude I never expected, not toward her, but toward myself, for having the courage to walk away when staying would have slowly erased who I was meant to become. Settled in like a closing chapter written without urgency, because nothing was left unresolved inside me anymore. I began mentoring quietly, not publicly, guiding people who reminded me of who I once was, capable but overlooked, patient but underestimated, and every time I saw confidence return to someone who had been made small by another's ego, I felt the cycle break cleanly. One of them asked me once how I learned to stay calm when disrespected, and the answer came without thought, because I learned that dignity is not defended with volume but with direction, and when you move forward deliberately, those who tried to diminish you are forced to watch from behind. Life rewarded that mindset in subtle ways, through partnerships that felt mutual, through relationships where gratitude was spoken instead of assumed, through love that arrived gently without needing to compete with ambition. I no longer introduced myself with my past or explained where I came from, because the present spoke clearly enough. Occasionally, her name surfaced less and less, fading into neutrality, until one day it appeared attached to news that she was starting over again, somewhere new, chasing something undefined. I wished her no harm, no success, no failure, just distance. And in that distance, I finally understood the full shape of my revenge, not the satisfaction of being proven right, but the peace of knowing I had outgrown the version of myself who once stood quietly in a crowd being told he did not belong. I belonged to my life now, fully, unapologetically, and the man who had been shouted down in public had become someone whose silence carried weight, whose presence no longer required permission, and whose future would never again depend on someone else remembering to invite him. I completed not with a dramatic event but with an internal shift so subtle it almost went unnoticed at first. I realized one morning that I no longer introduced new experiences by comparing them to old ones, no longer evaluated joy through the lens of what I had survived. I was simply present. Fully. Authentically. I built friendships that didn't require me to prove loyalty through sacrifice and relationships that didn't mistake my steadiness for silence. Love, when it returned to my life, came without conditions, without competition, without the need to diminish one person so another could feel tall. It was mutual, respectful, calm, and in that calm, I finally understood how distorted my understanding of partnership had once been. I no longer had to earn basic regard. It was offered freely. One evening, while organizing old documents, I came across a photo from years ago, a blurry image taken before everything fractured, and instead of pain, I felt appreciation for the man in that picture who stayed kind even when he was misunderstood. He didn't know it then, but his restraint would become his strength. He didn't know that walking away would open doors he hadn't even known existed. And as I placed the photo back where it belonged, not hidden, not displayed, just filed away, I understood the final truth of my story. That day she shouted in front of everyone was not the moment my dignity was taken, it was the moment it stopped being negotiable. From that point on, every step I took was toward a life where respect was the foundation, not the reward. And that is how the story truly ends, not with revenge shouted from rooftops, but with a man standing firmly in a life he chose, no longer waiting to be invited into rooms where he had always deserved to be welcomed. In a quiet victory, the kind that no one applauds but that resonate deeper than any public recognition. I traveled for work and pleasure, not to impress anyone, but to satisfy curiosity and cultivate experiences I had long postponed while trying to maintain someone else's narrative. I learned new skills, attended conferences, spoke at panels, and every time I did, I felt the steady hum of self-respect growing stronger. One day, months into a project that required international collaboration, I received a message from someone she trusted professionally, praising the work I had done and noting how my approach had changed the outcome of their initiative. I realized she was hearing about me indirectly again, not from me, not from shared history, but through the results I quietly produced. There was no malice in it, no triumph intended, just the proof that I could thrive on my own terms. That night, I reflected on the trajectory of my life and understood fully that the most powerful revenge is invisibly woven into every aspect of the life you build when you stop letting others define your worth. I smiled at the thought because it wasn't about her anymore. It was about the freedom that comes from realizing that the man who once stood humiliated in a living room full of witnesses had grown into someone whose presence carried authority and peace, without needing anyone else's validation. And in that realization, I finally experienced the quiet satisfaction that comes from being untouchable, not by force or confrontation, but by the simple act of choosing oneself above all else. Top of form next began with a sense of rhythm I hadn't felt in years, the quiet cadence of a life no longer dictated by someone else's pride or expectations. Every morning, I woke up with intention, planning my day around purpose rather than approval. I started writing again, not for accolades, but to capture thoughts that had long been buried under resentment and disappointment. Words poured out of me easily, each sentence a subtle assertion of self-worth, each paragraph a reminder that the man I had become was defined by his choices, not by how others treated him. Months later, a former colleague, someone who had known both her and me, reached out, mentioning how they had watched the shift silently, amazed at how composed and accomplished I had grown, and for the first time I realized that the story of my rise was being told without me even needing to narrate it. That night, I thought about her again. Not with longing, not with anger, but with the calm understanding that she had played her part, and I had played mine. She had revealed the person I didn't want to be, and in doing so, had propelled me toward the life I was meant to live. The irony wasn't lost on me. The humiliation she had intended to inflict became the catalyst for my freedom. I finally understood that revenge doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need confrontation, public spectacle, or vindictive gestures. True revenge is silent. True revenge is thriving in a world where the person who tried to diminish you is no longer capable of touching the life you've built. I closed my laptop that night with a lightness I hadn't felt in over a decade, fully aware that I had finally, completely, and irrevocably won, not over her, but over every limitation she had imposed on me by underestimating my worth. Bottom of form. Unfolded as the calm aftermath of years spent rebuilding a life quietly but deliberately. I no longer measured achievements against anyone else's milestones. My days were structured around growth, learning, and meaningful connections rather than validation or recognition. One afternoon, while speaking at a leadership seminar, I caught sight of someone in the back of the room. She had come, unnoticed, not to confront me but simply observing. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw in her gaze the faint echo of the pride she once flaunted, now tinged with understanding and perhaps regret. I smiled politely and returned to my presentation. There was no satisfaction in her reaction, no gloating, no sense of victory. It didn't matter. The point wasn't to witness her realization, it was that I no longer needed her recognition to feel complete. Later that evening, walking home, I reflected on the journey that had begun with humiliation and betrayal, and I realized that the true victory had never been revenge in the conventional sense. It had been reclamation of my time, my dignity, my ambitions, and my peace. The man who had once stood small and unseen was now fully present in every room he entered. And that presence alone, steady and undeniable, ensured that the life she once tried to exclude me from was now entirely mine, untouched, unchallenged, and free from anyone's shadow but my own. I began to feel almost like routine, a life so self-directed that the memory of her shouting in that living room felt more like a distant echo than a wound. I traveled more, networked intentionally, and surrounded myself with people whose presence elevated rather than diminished me. Each project I completed, each conversation I navigated with calm authority, reminded me that the respect I had longed for was now freely given, not borrowed, not assumed, not contingent. One evening, a former friend casually mentioned that she had moved again, starting over in a city far from ours. There was no gossip in the tone, no bitterness, only the matter-of-fact way life's changes are reported. And I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no schadenfreude, just the quiet relief that the story I had once lived in shadows was now entirely outside of her hands. Months later, I attended a celebratory event for a colleague I had mentored, and in that space, I realized that my sense of belonging no longer depended on anyone's invitation, approval, or acknowledgement. I was present because I had earned it through integrity, patience, and resilience. Looking around at the people whose lives I had touched and the networks I had built, I understood fully that the most lasting revenge had been lived in silence, cultivated through my growth, and manifested in the simple fact that I was no longer waiting for someone to see my worth. The world was already watching, and I had never felt freer. Unfolded like a quiet triumph that needed no announcement, no ceremony, no witnesses. Life had settled into a rhythm where every decision I made was intentional, every relationship reciprocal, and every success earned rather than granted. I began to invest in ventures I had once only dreamed of, attended events I had once been excluded from, and spoke in rooms where my voice carried weight because of the substance behind it, not the volume. One evening, a message arrived from a mutual connection who had worked with both of us years ago. They mentioned her again, noting her recent struggles navigating professional spaces she had once thought familiar. I read the message and felt a calm detachment, an understanding that the person she had been, the one who shouted, dismissed, and underestimated, was still learning what it meant to navigate the world with grace. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. My life was no longer intertwined with hers, and the satisfaction I had once imagined from confrontation had been replaced with a deeper, quieter knowledge. I had outgrown the need for revenge because I had built something stronger than resentment, a life defined by respect, autonomy, and peace. Later that week, standing in a room full of colleagues, friends, and students I had mentored, I realized that the man who had once been humiliated now commanded a presence that could not be denied. That presence was my revenge. It was quiet, inevitable, and absolute, and it carried more weight than any shout, insult, or spectacle ever could. Later, it began to feel like a natural continuation of everything I had built, the sort of progress that arrives slowly, imperceptibly, and then one day you realize the transformation is complete. I no longer defined myself by her judgment, her approval, or her absence. Every decision I made was anchored in clarity and purpose, every project I took on reflected my values, and every relationship honored mutual respect. One afternoon, while attending a professional retreat, I overheard someone referencing a story from years ago about a couple where one partner had been overlooked despite supporting the other tirelessly. I didn't need to look up to know who they were talking about. For the first time, I felt no sting, no desire to correct the narrative. Instead, I recognized the irony. While she had tried to diminish me publicly, my life had grown independently, fully, and beyond the reach of her influence. That evening, as I walked through the quiet streets after the retreat, I felt a lightness that had nothing to do with circumstance and everything to do with internal resolution. The man who had once stood small, humiliated, and unheard was now the one who carried serenity, confidence, and authority in every step he took. And that, I understood fully, was the ultimate form of revenge, not spectacle, not confrontation, but the absolute reclaiming of self, the creation of a life so complete that the people who once tried to diminish you become irrelevant in the story of your own success. Settling into a rhythm that no one could notice from the outside, because it was internal, profound, and utterly unshakable. I woke up each morning without the shadow of expectation from anyone else, without the need to justify my presence or accomplishments. My days were full, not crowded, structured not by obligation but by choice. I pursued ventures that challenged me, traveled to places I had long wanted to see, and built relationships rooted in genuine respect rather than convenience or necessity. One evening, while reviewing correspondence for a project, I came across her name in a professional context again, not directly to me, but through mutual colleagues sharing updates. The sight of it no longer sparked any emotion except a quiet acknowledgement that our paths had diverged completely. I realized in that moment that my life had become a space where her influence had no power, where her opinions no longer mattered, and where the lessons I had learned from our shared history had translated into freedom. Walking past the city lights that night, I understood fully that the loud humiliation she had once inflicted had become the catalyst for a life built on autonomy, dignity, and steady growth. And for the first time, I felt complete not because anyone recognized me, but because I had finally recognized myself, and in that recognition, I had achieved the truest, most lasting revenge imaginable, a life wholly my own. Arrived not with drama but with clarity, the kind of clarity that settles like sunlight through a window after a storm has passed. Years had shaped me into someone unrecognizable from the man who once stood in that living room, silenced and humiliated, begging for acknowledgement he didn't need. Every project completed, every connection nurtured, every quiet victory had built a life so solid, so self-contained, that the idea of her shouting at me again seemed absurd, almost distant, as though it had belonged to another person entirely. Then came an unexpected moment of closure. I was attending an awards ceremony for emerging leaders when I noticed her name in the program, listed as a presenter. My first instinct was to turn away, but curiosity anchored me in place. She walked up to the stage, flawless, confident, but when she spoke, the room seemed to hang on every word, and I saw the subtle tremor in her hands betray the perfection she tried to project. I realized she had finally stepped into a room where she couldn't lean on anyone else's labor, where no one would silently prop her up. Her moment of pride, long imagined as a solo triumph, was in reality tempered by all she had overlooked. I didn't smile. I didn't revel. I simply watched, calm, knowing that life had balanced itself in the most poetic way. I was thriving quietly, independently, and fully, while she learned, perhaps too late, that the foundations she had ignored were what gave me my strength. As the ceremony ended, our eyes met one last time. There was no anger, no bitterness, only the faintest recognition that we had both changed, but in completely different directions. She had built a version of success that demanded validation. I had built a life that required none. Walking away from that room, I felt an unfamiliar but exquisite sensation, complete freedom. The man who had once been laughed at in front of everyone now carried himself without fear, without apology, without dependence. And in that freedom, I understood the ultimate truth. The most powerful revenge is not in proving someone wrong, it is in becoming so untouchable, so undeniably whole, that their voice, their pride, their shouting, no longer has the power to reach you. Life itself becomes the revenge, lived quietly, beautifully, and without ever needing to be witnessed. The story ends not with confrontation, but with triumph so serene it almost goes unnoticed, because the greatest victories are invisible to those who once sought to diminish you.